soldiers on the other side until more Union soldiers showed up behind them. And the slaughter over here was just terrible. Came here not long after, and if you look behind you here, you can see one of the famous photos they took.
For over a century, this photograph remained hidden where no one would think to look. When it finally surfaced, experts assumed it would be another damaged Civil War relic, faded and harmless.
Three great heroes of American history. So even as late as the turn of the century, he's part of this heroic firmament.
But they were wrong. The moment experts enlarged the image, the room went silent because one man in the frame was not supposed to exist at all. Records said he vanished days earlier, yet there he stood beside Abraham Lincoln, alive and watching. What this image revealed was not forgotten history, but a buried secret that had waited patiently to be seen.
It's important to us as Americans today because by all historical rights, we shouldn't be here.
That day, Claire Donovan had not gone into the attic looking for anything important. She had been sorting through old insulation and broken furniture, clearing space in a house that had belonged to her family for generations. Near the far edge of the attic, where the ceiling sloped low and the air felt stale, she noticed a wooden trunk jammed behind a support beam. It had been pushed so far back that it could not have been placed there casually. The angle suggested someone had forced it into the narrow gap, then covered it deliberately, as if hoping time itself would forget it was there. The trunk was heavier than it should have been, its metal clasps were rusted shut, and the wood showed signs of water exposure that did not match the rest of the attic. When Claire finally pried it open, she found no clothes, no heirlooms, and no valuables. Instead, there were neatly stacked railroad bonds, a bundle of old letters tied with twine, and one object set apart from the rest. It was a single photograph lying at the bottom, wrapped tightly in thick wax paper that had gone brittle with age. The paper released a sharp, unpleasant smell when she touched it, like dried tobacco mixed with old adhesive. It was the kind of scent that suggested chemical treatment rather than simple age. The wrapping had been sealed carefully, folded multiple times, as if someone had been more concerned with preservation than concealment. Claire hesitated before opening it, already sensing that whatever was inside had been separated from the rest for a reason. When she finally peeled back the wax paper, the image beneath stopped her cold. The photograph was not faded or damaged. It was unnervingly clear. The sharpness of the image did not match anything she had ever seen from the 19th century. The faces were defined, the edges clean, and the depth intact, as though the picture had been taken recently and then artificially aged. At the center of the image stood Abraham Lincoln. He appeared taller and thinner than in most familiar portraits, with his black frock coat sharply outlined against the background. His face was rigid and his expression controlled, yet his eyes carried a depth that felt intentional rather than accidental. They did not look vacant or softened by long exposure times common to early photography. They looked alert, focused, and unsettlingly present. Standing near him was Ulysses S. Grant, along with several Union officers arranged in a stiff, formal grouping. None of them smiled or appeared relaxed. Their posture suggested they were not posing for history, but complying with a request. The arrangement felt functional, not commemorative, as if the photograph served a purpose beyond documentation. Then Claire noticed the color. This was not hand-tinted sepia or faded brown. The blues in the uniforms were deep and consistent. The black coats absorbed light naturally, and the skin tones appeared muted but real without the blotchy application typical of later colorization. The color behaved as though it had been captured at the moment the shutter closed, not added afterward. It looked wrong for 1865 in a way that could not be explained by preservation or restoration. The stillness of the figures intensified the unease. They looked frozen, not by the limitations of early cameras, but by something else entirely. It gave the impression that the photograph had captured an interrupted moment of a group of men caught in the middle of something unresolved. Claire understood immediately that this was not a family keepsake. Nothing about it felt accidental or sentimental. Every detail, from the careful wrapping to the placement in the trunk, suggested intention. The photograph did not just contradict what she knew about Civil War history. It violated the basic rules of how that history was supposed to be recorded. Standing alone in the attic, holding an image that should not have existed, Claire realized she was looking at something that had been hidden on purpose. And whatever it revealed, someone had worked very hard to make sure it was never seen. She needed help and did not take the photograph to just anyone. She chose Professor George Kramer because his reputation was built on skepticism. Kramer was known for dismantling hoaxes, not entertaining them, and Claire assumed he would tell her the image was a clever fake and send her home. When she placed the photograph on his desk, she expected dismissal. What she did not expect was silence. Kramer stared at the image for a long time without touching it. His expression tightened as he leaned closer, adjusted his glasses, and scanned details that Claire had already memorized. When he finally lifted the photograph, his hands did not steady themselves. His face lost color as if he had just realized the implications of what he was holding. He did not comment on Lincoln or Grant. He focused immediately on the surface of the print. "This should not look like this," he said quietly. Kramer began with the assumption of forgery running through every known method used to fake Civil War photographs. He examined the paper fibers, the silver nitrate breakdown, and the edge wear. Each test confirmed the same conclusion. The photograph was an albumin silver print manufactured in the 1860s. There were no modern materials present or any later interventions. The base itself was authentic. The problem was the color. In a controlled lab environment, Kramer conducted chemical tests that ruled out hand coloring or surface tinting. The pigments were not applied on top of the image, but were embedded inside the paper layers. The color had bonded during development, not after. This alone made the photograph impossible by known standards. Color processes from the period were unstable, inconsistent, and short-lived. This image showed none of those weaknesses. Kramer contacted colleagues at the New York Historical Society, careful about how he described the find. When the photo was scanned using spectral imaging, the results caused immediate concern. The pigments were organic. Traces of beetroot and indigo were identified, substances documented in early experimental dyes but never successfully integrated into photographic development. According to official history, those experiments failed and were abandoned. Yet the scans showed uniform pigment distribution and long-term chemical stability. This was not a failed experiment, but a perfected one. The imaging suggested a hybrid process using light reactive oils, something not officially achieved until the 20th century. The technology appeared to predate Kodachrome by more than 50 years. There were no civilian labs capable of producing such results during the Civil War, meaning that the photo had government involvement. When Kramer reviewed archived War Department research references, he found something unsettling. There were brief mentions of experimental imaging programs intended for intelligence documentation. The notes were vague, poorly indexed, and abruptly ended. According to public records, these programs produced nothing usable and were quietly shut down. The photograph contradicted that narrative. Kramer finally shared his conclusion with Claire. He suggested that the image was not created as a portrait, but as a controlled artifact, and the sophistication implied authorization at the highest level. In his opinion, the photograph could not have been produced without direct approval from the executive branch. He went further, suggesting it may have been commissioned under classified presidential authority. This reframed the image entirely. It was no longer a historical curiosity or family artifact, but a deliberate creation designed to endure. The pigments were chosen not for appearance, but for longevity, and the method prioritized survival across decades, not aesthetics. The team began referring to it as a legacy image, meant to outlast memory, testimony, and official paperwork. It was something physical that could not be dismissed once found. That realization introduced a new question that none of them wanted to voice openly. If the government had created technology decades ahead of its time, then erased all evidence of it, why had this image survived? And more importantly, what had it been meant to prove, long after the men inside it were gone? With the photograph now confirmed as authentic, Claire turned to the one place she believed would ground the mystery in something solid. If the image had been created under government authority, then the men inside it should have been documented somewhere. She began with her own family history, searching for anything that might explain why such an image had ended up in her attic. That was when the silence in the archives became impossible to ignore. William Donovan, her great-great-grandfather, appeared at first like an unremarkable entry in Civil War databases. His name surfaced in early enlistment roles as a Union Army medic, assigned to field hospitals and supply convoys. The records were clean, routine, and uneventful. There was nothing to suggest proximity to power, secrecy, or distinction. Then, abruptly, the file stopped. The final entry was brief and clinical. Missing in action, April 6, 1865. There was no accompanying report, no battlefield description, or any witness statements. The entry sat alone, unconnected to any engagement large enough to justify the disappearance of a medic. Claire searched for casualty lists from that period, and Donovan's name did not appear. She searched burial records and found nothing. Even his pension rolls showed no claim filed by a widow or family member, which was highly unusual even for soldiers presumed dead. Claire expanded her search, assuming the records had been misfiled or damaged. She found nothing, not a death certificate or a transfer order or a formal discharge. It was as if the Union Army had ended his service with a single sentence and never acknowledged him again. The absence felt intentional. Systems designed to track millions of soldiers do not simply forget one man. The most disturbing detail surfaced when Claire compared dates. The photograph had been tentatively dated to April 9, 1865, based on Lincoln's known movements and Grant's uniform. That placed the image 3 days after Donovan's official disappearance. At first, she assumed coincidence until she noticed the figure in the photograph standing between Lincoln and Grant. It was a man without visible rank or insignia, too centrally placed to be incidental. It was then that the placement bothered her. Official photographs were meticulously catalogued, and every officer present was normally identified. Yet when Claire cross-referenced similar images, the man in that position was never named. It was as if the space he occupied was not meant to be filled by anyone history was allowed to remember. The final muster report added another layer of discomfort. It noted Donovan as absent without explanation and moved on. There was no investigation, no follow-up or correction. The language suggested closure without resolution. That kind of administrative silence usually followed reclassification, not death. Claire began to suspect that Donovan had not been lost to chaos or combat. The pattern pointed toward reassignment, not to another unit, but removal. It suggested a shift into a role that required no documentation and left no trace. A position where a man could still serve, still stand close to power, while being officially declared gone. When she shared her findings with Kramer, they both understood what the records implied without saying it aloud. A man could be erased on paper while remaining physically present. The archives had not failed to preserve Donovan's story. So who else had they done that to? By now, Claire was determined to find out who the unnamed man in the photo beside Lincoln was. She had enlarged the photograph dozens of times by then, studying every face for signs of familiarity, without figuring it out. It was when she passed by a framed family portrait that had hung for years in her parents' hallway that it hit her. The photograph dated back to 1862, and it showed a young man with deep-set eyes, a narrow jaw, and eyebrows that sloped downward in a way Claire had always thought looked severe. When she placed the two images side by side, she saw the shocking truth. The man in the Civil War photograph was older, sharper, and standing straighter, but the structure of the face was identical. The jawline matched perfectly, and the eyebrows followed the same downward angle. Even the spacing of the eyes aligned when the images were overlaid digitally. There was no margin for coincidence. The unnamed figure standing between Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant was her great-great-grandfather, William Donovan. Claire felt a wave of disbelief give way to something colder. Her family had spent generations believing Donovan died anonymously in the final days of the war. The photograph proved he had been alive days after his official disappearance, standing closer to the president than any documented officer. That alone rewrote everything they thought they knew about him. The experts examined Donovan's position more carefully once his identity was confirmed. He wore no visible rank, and no insignia marked him as a medic or officer. His uniform was deliberately plain and stripped of identifiers. In a photograph where every other figure represented a title or command, Donovan existed without classification. He was present, yet unacknowledged. What unsettled them most was his posture. While Lincoln and Grant faced forward in rigid compliance with the camera, Donovan's eyes were angled slightly outward. His attention was not on the lens, but on the edges of the frame. He looked like someone monitoring a perimeter, rather than participating in a portrait. The placement suggested readiness, not ceremony. This was not how medics stood. Medics appeared at the margins, behind officers if they appeared at all. Donovan's position placed him within arm's reach of the president. That level of proximity was reserved for men whose presence was operational, not symbolic. Someone had chosen where he stood. As the group studied Lincoln's known habits in the final weeks of his life, a pattern emerged. The president had grown increasingly distrustful of his own cabinet and security arrangements. Several advisors had been quietly sidelined, and others were kept at a distance. The idea that Lincoln might have relied on an informal inner circle no longer seemed implausible. Donovan's presence fit that theory too cleanly to ignore. He was close enough to hear everything, close enough to intervene if necessary, and obscure enough that his actions would never appear in official reports. The emotional impact on Claire was delayed but profound. Her ancestor had not died forgotten on a battlefield. Rather, he had been standing at the center of history's most examined moment, performing a role that history refused to acknowledge. The family's grief had been built on a lie maintained by silence. The photograph no longer felt like a mystery artifact. It felt like the testimony of a fixed moment capturing a man whose life had been divided into two versions, one recorded for public consumption and one deliberately erased. He was the escort that officially never existed. With his identity was confirmed, Claire and Kramer shifted their focus away from the photograph and toward the machinery that had erased him. If Donovan had stood that close to Lincoln, there had to be a structure that placed him there. Kramer returned to the War Department archives, this time abandoning indexed databases and turning to handwritten logs rarely requested and even more rarely examined. The breakthrough came in a bound volume mislabeled as a supply reconciliation ledger. Buried between routine entries was a short handwritten note that did not match the surrounding handwriting. It mentioned a Donovan with no first name, followed by a line that froze Kramer in place. The note stated the man had been personally selected by the president. There were no ranks listed or a unit assigned, just a name and an authority that bypassed everything else. Further examination revealed a reference to something called the Presidential Escort Committee. The term appeared only once, with no header, no charter, or any explanation. Kramer initially assumed it was shorthand or an informal nickname, but the language surrounding it was precise. It described a group of men tasked with remaining in proximity to the president without appearing on any official roster. The log referred to them as unregistered men. They were not paid through standard channels and did not report to generals or cabinet officials. Their orders came directly from Lincoln himself, delivered verbally or through handwritten notes that were destroyed after reading. The structure was intentional to leave no trail. As Kramer traced marginal symbols and initials across several pages, a pattern emerged. A recurring mark, WD, appeared next to notes referencing reassignment and relocation. Cross-referencing dates aligned those markings with William Donovan's disappearance from official service records. The implication was immediate and unsettling. Donovan had not gone missing. He had been moved. One field note described a transfer to what it called a shadow post. The phrase carried no formal definition, but the accompanying instruction was explicit. The men assigned were not to carry visible weapons. They were to observe, remain close, and intervene only if the situation became terminal. The wording suggested anticipation of a specific outcome rather than general protection. Claire and Kramer began to understand the logic behind the PEC. Lincoln, in the final weeks of the war, had reason to distrust his own circle. Leaks, shifting loyalties, and political fractures had left him exposed. Creating a formal security unit would have alerted the very people he suspected. However, an informal one that was invisible on paper would not. The PEC was not designed to stop public threats. It was meant to protect the presidency from insiders. Donovan's background as a medic now made sense. Medics moved freely. They were trusted and overlooked. A man trained to observe wounds and behavior would not attract suspicion. Placing him near the president without rank ensured he would not be questioned. What disturbed Claire most was how little survived of the PEC. Aside from that single mention, there were no rosters, no after-action reports, and no dissolution orders. The group appeared, operated briefly, and vanished. It was as if it had been designed to expire the moment Lincoln was gone. By the end of the day, Claire and Kramer were no longer asking whether the Presidential Escort Committee existed. The evidence said it had. The real question was why a president would need a secret guard to watch his own government, and what Donovan had seen while standing there, silent and unrecorded, as history reached its breaking point. The detail that changed everything was not visible to the naked eye. The photograph had already been scanned dozens of times. But Kramer's colleague, Elsa Turnbaum, insisted on running one final pass using extreme digital magnification, far beyond what was needed for facial or pigment analysis. She focused not on the faces, but on the clothing, specifically the collar of the unidentified man they now knew was William Donovan. At normal resolution, the fabric appeared plain, dark, and unremarkable. Under magnification, it began to separate into threads. That was when Elsa stopped scrolling. Tucked beneath the fold of Donovan's collar, partially obscured by shadow and the angle of his stance, was a minute embroidered marking. It was not a decorative tailor's flourish. It was deliberate and precise. 3 letters, stitched tightly into the wool using thread nearly identical in color to the surrounding fabric. PEC. No one spoke at first. The letters were small enough to evade casual inspection, but clear once seen. They confirmed what had previously existed only as speculation in a single War Department log. The Presidential Escort Committee had not only existed, but its members had been marked. As Elsa continued scanning downward, another irregularity appeared. Beneath the badge, stitched in a thread just a shade lighter than the wool itself, was a line of text. It was so subtle that even high-resolution scans blurred it unless contrast was manually adjusted. When the letters finally resolved, the effect on the room was immediate. Target verified. Stand until April 14th. No one needed to ask what April 14th meant. Every person in the room knew the date by memory. April 14, 1865 was the night Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater. The instruction was not vague. It did not say watch or protect. It said stand. It carried an endpoint. The implications settled slowly and then all at once. This was not a warning or a prediction written after the fact. The stitching was embedded in the original garment, captured by the photograph in real time. That meant the instruction existed before the assassination. Donovan had been operating under orders that acknowledged a fixed date. The word target introduced a deeper unease as it was not clarified. It did not specify Lincoln by name or explain the nature of the threat. It assumed shared understanding between the issuer and the recipient. Whatever was coming, Donovan had already been briefed. For Kramer, the meaning was unavoidable. If the Presidential Escort Committee had been created to watch insiders, then this instruction suggested that Donovan was there to stop the event. The room felt different after that. The photograph no longer represented a hidden technology or an erased man. It represented foreknowledge. Someone within the highest levels of power had anticipated the president's death with enough certainty to encode it into a garment. Donovan had stood there, close enough to touch Lincoln, knowing the clock was already running, and history had been written as if no one saw it coming. It was then that Claire revealed a letter she had found in the album. It was so fragile that it seemed on the verge of crumbling. She had not opened it out of fear of destroying it. Kramer, using the right tools, carefully opened it. The yellowed and brittle envelope bore only a simple inscription, "From A.L." Inside, the handwriting was deliberate and cold, with the ink faded but legible. Dated April 10, 1865, the letter arrived 4 days before Lincoln would die, yet its words carried a weight that defied time. Truth rarely survives the men who need it most. Lincoln's words made the room fall silent. Donovan had been invisible while standing among those who shaped history in secrecy. The letter instructed him to accept erasure and to endure the burden of knowledge alone. Every word suggested that the photograph was not mere documentation, but a deliberate testament left for someone far in the future who might one day uncover it. The implication was clear. Donovan had spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of his failure to save Lincoln. He had survived the war, survived erasure, and carried the knowledge of Lincoln's death with him until the end. The instruction to burn the photo was a warning meant to protect secrets that were never meant to see daylight, but fate had intervened. The artifact had survived, bridging a century and revealing Donovan's existence to Claire and the world. For the first time, the photograph was more than a historical anomaly. It was a record of a man who had watched the world as it turned toward chaos and could do nothing but stand. The inner circle of power had left him unseen, yet the photo ensured he would finally be remembered. The truth was out, but the dread it brought was a cold one. The silent man, once a shadow in the corner of history, now stood as a witness to a moment the world could never forget. After 100 years of silence, Donovan's story was finally told, not as a ghost story, but as a chilling historical testimony. It was a warning that left the experts who looked upon the photograph with the profound and unsettling understanding that history's most critical witnesses are often those we never see. Make sure to click the cards on the screen now for more interesting videos. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.